Jim Webb is touring the country telling people we need to put our American house in order. He says we desperately need to fix our country. The former U.S. Senator from Virginia bills himself as someone who can work both sides of the aisle after spending 4 years in the Reagan administration and then serving in the Senate as a Democrat. He is a former combat Marine, a counsel in Congress, an Assistant Secretary of Defense and Secretary of the Navy, and he's an Emmy-winning journalist, a filmmaker, and the author of 10 books. He's been a fellow at the Harvard Institute of Politics and taught literature at the U.S. Naval Academy. At 69, what's left? Well, we think he would like to be President of the United States. While in the U.S. Senate, Jim Webb was selected to deliver the response to the President's State of the Union address in 2007 and served on the Foreign Relations and Armed Services, Veterans Affairs, and the Joint Economics Committee. Please join me now in welcoming Jim Webb to South Florida.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be with all of you today, and I would like to express my appreciation to everyone at the Forum Club for having been in contact with us for now almost a year, I think, from the time we were first invited to be here. And I'd like to start by saying that every time I come to Florida, particularly in recent years, I think about two people, and it's not Jeb Bush and Marco Rubio, by the way. First is my dad, who, like so many people who came to Florida, dreamed of this as the magical place. Growing up in Missouri, out of Kentucky, and during the time that I was a kid, used to come down here with his best friend over in the Sarasota area, who had served 3.5 years in World War II. I don't know if many of you have seen that classic film, The Best Years of Our Lives. It's a magnificent movie. I just watched it again over the weekend with my wife. But my Uncle Bud Caldwell, who came down here, had spent 3.5 years overseas and came back, and he used to say that was the best years of my wife. But he became legally blind at the end of that period and moved down to Sarasota, bought an old ramshackle house, and learned how to work with his hands, even though he could no longer see in a way that we could. He lost all his direct vision. And my dad would come down and help him. So from the time that I was really small, we would come over to the Sarasota area and watch as Florida just exploded with people and commerce in a way that had not been there before World War II. We used to go over on Longboat Key, where there wasn't a building on Longboat Key. We'd go out on the beach, dig a hole in the sand, put a charcoal pit over it, barbecue, stick our watermelons into the Gulf of Mexico. And the other person I think about is Minister Mentor Lee Kuan Yew, who created modern Singapore. Really, his genius created modern Singapore, who just passed away about a month ago. One of the most brilliant minds of the last 100 years. But when people were asking a few years ago what was the greatest invention in modern history, the typical answer had been the printing press, because it enabled the average person to access information in a way that in the era of the scribes was not possible. But Lee Kuan Yew insisted it was the air conditioner. He said, take a look at Southeast Asia and the work habits that were required when you weren't able to get out of the heat all the time. And so I kind of look at Florida the same way. If you look at southern Florida, areas that used to be basically swamp, and now, because of air conditioning and refrigeration, have completely changed. I have been advised I have about 20 minutes to give you some of my thoughts, and then we're going to open it up for 20 minutes of questions. And I'd like to talk to you about the three major issues that have concerned me for many, many years in and out of government, and how we might think about approaching them in the future. When I ran for the Senate in 2006, I had been out of government for a while. I've had 4 different periods in my life where I would go into public service for a while, then take a break, come back out, write, do journalism, miss running things, miss the challenge of leadership, come back in again. I served in the Marine Corps, got out, went to law school, came back and was a committee counsel for 4 years, went back out, wrote books, did journalism, covered the Marines in Beirut in 1983 for PBS. After the building blew up, those of you who remember October 23rd, 1983, when we lost 242 Americans in one day, I called up the Reagan administration and I said, I want to put my oar in the water. You know, I want to serve again. Came back in, served 4 years. After 4 years, went back out and did other things. But in late '05 and early '06, I had become very concerned about the direction of our national military policy. I had written the first article in a major publication in the Washington Post warning about the strategic inadvisability of invading Iraq, saying that this was going to empower Iran, that it was going to bog us down, that we're going to see sectarian violence, and then in the long run, we ran the risk of empowering China economically in a different way as we took our eye off of that part of the world, which is so vitally important to us strategically, commercially, and culturally. And so I decided to run for the Senate 9 months to the day before the election with no money, no campaign staff, against an incumbent who had just received the highest number of votes for president in the Conservative Political Action Conference that year. On a good day, we were 33 points behind. But I set out talking about these major themes that we need to be focusing on. And every day we would get up. Actually, the first person I called when I decided to run was not a political consultant. It was one of my radio operators from Vietnam. I went through 6 radio operators in the Marine Corps infantry in Vietnam. Mac McGarvey got his arm blown off. Went out and got a tattoo on the stump, said cut on dotted line. Definitely a man you can trust. And when I decided to run, I called him. He was a night manager of Tootsie's Orchid Lounge in Nashville, Tennessee. And I said, man, I need you. You know, I need you to come up here. I need somebody I can talk to 24 hours a day. So he quit his job, moved into our basement for a year, and became my driver. And early on in the campaign, the Washington Post wrote an article and said, what kind of a campaign is it that's got a one-armed driver who drinks at lunch? The only thing I can say is we won. And the issues that we put on the table are the same ones that I would ask you to think about today, and that is restoring true notions of economic fairness and social justice in this country so that all Americans can believe that we really do have something called the American dream and that it is open to people who have what it takes to achieve it, number one. Number two, restoring a proper national security strategy and how we use our military forces around the world. And number three, rebalancing the relationship between the presidency and the Congress that has gotten tilted so far toward the presidency, particularly since 9/11. Those three themes. And let me start with the economic fairness and social justice issue, the American dream. When I started talking about this, we'll talk about social justice first, I was campaigning in Virginia, a traditionally very conservative state when it comes to criminal justice, and I started saying our criminal justice system is broken. You see a lot of people talking about this over the past couple of years. When I started talking about it in '06, I had Democratic Party advisors coming to me and saying, you're committing political suicide. You're in Virginia. You're talking about issues of mass incarceration and how there are alternative ways to handle a lot of these difficulties. And my reaction was, look, we got 5% of the world's population, 25% of the world's known prison population, and it's not getting any better when it comes to how people feel in their own neighborhoods regarding their safety. That's not a political issue, that's a leadership issue, and we can fix that issue. When I got to the Senate, we held 2.5 years of hearings. I wasn't on the Judiciary Committee, which would have handled the legislation, but I was on the Joint Economic Committee. So I decided we could hold hearings on the economic consequences of mass incarceration, the economic consequences of drugs policy, the way that we're approaching them. We partnered up with George Mason Law School. We did a forum on drugs in America and how to resolve it. We introduced a piece of legislation basically saying, let's get the brightest minds in America to come together for a commission for 18 months, not one of these permanent things that's going to go on forever, and tell us how we need to approach differently the entire spectrum of our criminal justice system, from point of apprehension to whether you decide to arrest, to what kind of a court somebody goes into if they are brought into the legal justice system, how long should somebody be sentenced, what should prison administration look like, how well trained should these people be inside prison administration, and what should the reentry programs look like. When we've got 7 million people involved in the criminal justice process at one point or another, either incarcerated or paroled or under supervision, we got 7 million people. We need to have reentry programs that are structured and smart for those who want to re-enter society at a productive level. We sat down with interest groups, stakeholders from across the philosophical spectrum. At the beginning, we got a lot of criticism. You know, this guy's soft on crime, et cetera, et cetera. But eventually, from our own office, meeting with these different stakeholders, we received the support all the way from the National Sheriff's Association, the International Association of Chiefs of Police, to the ACLU, and I like to say I think this may have been the only piece of legislation in my time in the Congress that was supported by the National Sheriff's Association on the one hand and the Marijuana Project on the other. We got it to the Senate floor at a time when everything was being filibustered. We were in the complete slowdown going under the 12 elections. We still got 57 votes out of 60 that we needed to break the filibuster. We lost on the legislation, but we did change the discussion in this country on criminal justice. There's no question about it. We brought it out of the shadows, we took the hits, and we got people talking about it. I've heard, you know, I don't follow every Republican candidate. You know that, right? But I've heard that Rand Paul has made this one of his top 3 issues as he is looking at the presidential nomination from the Republican side. It's just common sense, folks. And when you look at what happened in Baltimore recently, not just in Baltimore, when you look at the breakdowns in a lot of our communities, a big part of this is how we are handling criminal justice issues on both sides, and we need to fix that. Which brings me to the American dream. I've heard recently people saying, some pretty smart people, saying privately, you know, we got 15% of this population we just should just write off. You know, they're never going to go anywhere. They're not getting an education. They're not going to work, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You know, I don't believe that. I really do not believe that. And I give you 2 good examples. The American dream allowed my mother to be all the way productive in this country. She was one of 8 children in East Arkansas, in a poverty-stricken area in the 1930s. 3 of those 8 kids died, not at childbirth, but at childhood in ways and of diseases that we don't even see in this country anymore. Can you imagine somebody dying of typhoid fever in America? It would be a headline. One of her sisters died of typhoid fever. Her father died when she was 10. And my grandmother had to make a decision, sort of a Sophie's choice, because she had gotten a job. My grandmother finally got a job when the Roosevelt administration started gearing up for World War II. She could get a bus into North Little Rock in the morning and make artillery shells. And as she was in that job, she heard that they wanted small, strong women to come to California to help build the bombers. the Rosie the Riveter story that so many of us know. So my grandmother made a choice. She had enough money to take one child with her. So she took her youngest child, my Aunt Carolyn, and left my mother in Arkansas. And from that, eventually, she met my father, who was a pilot, and they had a life that is the kind of life we all want in this country. And I benefited. You know, I benefited. I think about it every day. We just saw the confirmation hearing of Loretta Lynch. And when she was introduced for the Attorney General's job, one of the people introduced me said her mother picked cotton so that she could go to school. Well, I'll tell you, my mother chopped cotton and picked a lot of strawberries so that I could be standing in front of you today. And the other person I think about is my wife, Hung. We just saw last week the 40th anniversary of the fall of Saigon. Hung was born in Vietnam on April the 29th, 1975. Her entire extended family got on a boat. Her father was a fisherman, left Vietnam, spent 4 days at sea, not knowing if they were going to live or die. The United States Navy picked them up at sea. At this point, 40 years ago, she was in a refugee camp in Guam. From there, they went to another refugee camp in Arkansas, Fort Chaffee, Arkansas, and then she grew up in New Orleans. She started working. Neither of her parents ever spoke fluent English. She started working at the age of 11. I've seen her Social Security work cards. She was working at a shrimp factory at the age of 11. She studied, like so many people in this room. She studied. She knew what education was about. She worked. She got scholarships. She went to the University of Michigan in their Asia Studies program, and she's a graduate of Cornell Law School. And I think about the people who are being left behind. I made a speech in September talking about this, about the power of the American dream. But what's the American dream if you can't see it in your own future? And I actually used two examples. Let's think about this today. One of the examples I gave was if you're a kid in East Baltimore, I said this last September, if you're a kid in East Baltimore, living in a place where the plumbing hasn't been fixed, looking down on the street and seeing that the only people that are really making money are the ones down there able to sell drugs, what is your view of the American dream? What's your view? Or, if you think about this, because Gail and I were talking about having common family out of the far southwest corner of Virginia in the Appalachian Mountains. If you're a kid in Clay County, Kentucky, which is 94% white, it's the poorest county in America, and people aren't paying attention to what you're going through because the assumption in so many of these policies is that if you are white, you're not a part of a formula. If you're white, it's your own fault that you're poor. How do you get out of there? What do you do? What's your view of the American dream? And I believe that with the right kind of leadership, we can make sure that all of these people are included. How do we do that? Education. Not just young education. What we need to do now is adult education as well. I introduced legislation when I was in the Senate. I called it the Second Chance Education Act. Let's think about this. 25% of the people in this country don't finish high school today. 1 out of every 4 doesn't finish high school. You can make a decision when you're 16 or 17 years old. Maybe you get pregnant, maybe you become rebellious, you leave school, then you get to be 28, 29 years old. And what are you going to do? How do you get back on that ramp, that entrance ramp? We can do that with focusing on not just the kids in those environments, but the parents. We had legislation where we were partnering up with different employers to give tax credits to assist people to get a high school diploma and to move on into community college. And so you can stand in front of your children and say, see, I did it. And if I can do it, you can do it. The greatest moment in my childhood was when my dad finished college. when I was a senior in high school. He went to night school for 26 years. You remember that? Some of you do. I mean, there's a Fats Domino song, 3 nights a week you're gone. You know, that was our family song for quite a while. But, he finished college at the University of Omaha. My senior year, I was sitting there in the bleachers, and I saw him poke along with all these 20-something kids, got his diploma, broke out of the line. I had a moment out of this movie Great Santini. Here he comes across the boys' gym, walking right toward me. I'm going, oh, geez, he's not really going to do this. And he did. He walked up and he stuck that diploma in my face. You know, and he said, you can get anything you want in this country, and don't you ever forget it. We can, that's okay. We do it through education. We do it through reforming our tax code. And we do it by reforming our criminal justice system. And we do it by providing rewards for people who step forward to serve our country. I'm very proud of the time that I was in the Senate for having written the post-9/11 GI Bill. I actually wrote it with committee counsel before I was even sworn in as a Senate. Ken Berquist is here. He was a fellow committee counsel with me all those years ago. He had the Senate side, I had the House side. We wrote a lot of bills. Introduced that on my first day, and we developed what I believe is a leadership prototype for how you can get things done even in a paralyzed governmental system. We partnered with the other side. I sat down and worked with Republicans. We got a World War II veteran, John Warner, a Vietnam veteran, Chuck Hagel, from the Republican side. We got Frank Lautenberg of New Jersey, World War II veteran from the Democratic side, and myself, and the 4 of us worked together, listened to people, and in 16 months, we were able to pass the most important GI Bill in history, the best GI Bill ever. And since that time, we've had now more than 1 million post-9/11 veterans have been able to use that for a first-class chance at the future. We do need to restructure our national security policy. We have not had a clearly enunciable doctrine, foreign policy doctrine, since the end of the Cold War. We've been going from crisis to crisis, kind of playing it as it lays ever since 9/11. And we need to be able to communicate to ourselves, to our own people, to our potential adversaries, to our allies, exactly the circumstances under which the United States is going to use its military power and where our strategic objectives lie. I've been a very strong proponent of invigorating our presence in East and Southeast Asia. I spent a lot of time in that part of the world with a lot of different hats on, as a government person, as a journalist, as a military planner when I was younger. And I have been speaking for many years about Chinese expansionism, incremental expansionism in areas of sovereignty and in terms of its military power at the same time that its economy has been growing. I started talking about an area called the Senkaku Islands 20 years ago, in between Taiwan and the Ryukyu Islands, Okinawa, where Japan is the recognized administrator by international law, and China has been challenging Japanese sovereignty. My last debate, when I ran for the Senate, we got to ask each other one question, and my opponent was on the Foreign Relations Committee. I asked him, what do you think we ought to do about the Senkaku Islands? There was this long silence, and we had the media room up above us, and you could see all the computers go on in the media room. People are Googling Senkaku. How do you spell that? Senkaku. But in April 2010, it became the dominant issue in East Asia when China started becoming more aggressive about sovereignty over these areas. And a lot of people are writing, well, it's just a bunch of rocks in the middle of nowhere. No, it's clear sovereignty issues with a long design for Chinese control, political control of essentially the entire South China Sea. And by the way, China has never recognized Okinawa to be a part of Japan. Okinawa is an essential part of our own national security policy and our relationship with Japan. In 2012, China created an entirely new prefecture, political prefecture, in the South China Sea. They claim 2 million square kilometers of area that go all the way down to the Strait of Malacca. Much of this area, most of this area, is claimed by other countries. They not only claimed it, they're now militarizing it. They put military structures down off the coast of the Philippines and also off the coast of Vietnam. We have to deal with these issues. I've spoke about it again and again while I was in the Senate. We have to demonstrate to China that these sorts of aggressions, long-term sovereignty issues, will not be allowed, that we will find multilateral fora in order to deal with them. We've been working hard with countries of ASEAN to get a united front against this sort of thing. And it's very important for us, not only militarily, people think this is simply military confrontations, but for the vast commercial importance of that part of the world. More than half of the commerce of the world in one way or another passes through those areas. I will jump very quickly to point number 3. I don't have a clock on. I don't know if I'm fine. Okay. We have seen, and I say this as someone who is considering running for president, I still firmly believe that we have seen far too much power in the balance between the presidency and the Congress move toward the institute of the presidency. This was apparent in the Bush administration. It is apparent in this administration. I wrote a long piece about this when I left the Senate in a magazine called The National Interest, talking about how this balance should have worked. There are many examples that I could go through, but the key point here is that there are a lot of things we're doing now, the President is doing now, and the Bush administration was doing through executive order that really should be going to the Congress for a clear examination and a vote on the specifics inside these policy changes. One quick example, because it's on a lot of people's minds, I was asked about it before coming in here, is the strategic framework agreement, proposed strategic framework agreement with Iran. I would make 3 points about that potential agreement. The bottom line before I make those points is that this kind of agreement should be examined and voted on in its specifics by the United States Congress. It should not be passed simply by an executive order from the presidency. There are too many serious, very serious security issues that are going to play out over a period of years, and it's going to be important for the cohesiveness of our country that bill be voted on with respect to its specific contents, or that agreement be voted on with respect to its specific contents. And I don't believe the Congress has even seen the agreement. We're talking only about a framework right now. So the amendments that are in front of the Congress right now, or the vote that the Congress is going to take, really does not go into the specifics of the agreement. They should. I made this point when the Bush administration entered into a strategic framework agreement with Iraq in late 2008, December of 2008. They entered into that agreement with an executive order, the president just signing off on it. The Iraqi parliament voted on it twice. We didn't even get to debate it. And that's not the sign of a healthy governmental system. It's one of the reasons that we have had this kind of paralysis. The Congress needs to step up and accept accountability, as well as utilizing the power that the Constitution gave it. This is a good place for me to stop, and I think I will just start taking questions. Thank you very much for your attentiveness. Thank you.
Okay, if our students are ready, the first question comes from our students. If you'll rise and say your name
members of the Forum Club, Senator Webb. My name is Carol Marcus, and I'm a student at Palm Beach State College in Boca Raton campus. I have been taking American government and international relations at political classes. And my question for you is, having been previously associated with the Reagan administration and combined with your strong military background, this would seem to present you with a difficult challenge in securing the Democratic nomination if you choose to run. How would you plan to turn those experiences to your advantage in a nationwide Democratic campaign? Thank you.
Good. Thank you for the question. Let me just start by saying that when I ran for the Senate, I had the same questions. And in fact, I was in a contested primary where we were outspent 10-1 by a person who had been a long-time Democratic Party activist. I got McGarvey, who I told you about. We got into an old Jeep, and we started driving from one place to another. We had 100 days before the primary, and we would do 3 meetings a night. And I would sit down with people, much as you can do, by the way, in places like Iowa, sit down with groups of people, and half the people in the room, every meeting would say, why should we vote for somebody who worked for Ronald Reagan? And I'd always start off by saying, well, wait a minute, I mean, Ronald Reagan once was a Democrat, you know. Not only that, but the Democrats elected Ronald Reagan. The Reagan Democrats elected Ronald Reagan. And I'd never run for office before. I'm not someone who, you know, was a Republican and then decided to switch. I'm very proud of having worked in the Reagan administration. I think he was a fine president, and I think he was what the country needed at a time when we were in somewhat of a malaise, similar to where we are now. People were wondering about presidential governance. So the first thing I would say is I'm proud I was able to serve my country at a time when we were doing great things. And the other is, running as a Democrat, for me, goes into this whole message that I was just talking to you about with respect to economic fairness and social justice. The Democratic Party, the traditional Democratic Party, has been the party that has always focused on giving a voice to the people who had no voice. I mean, when I mentioned small things like my grandmother being able to get a job in an artillery factory, there was nothing out there until Roosevelt came into office. And that Democratic Party, the party that believes that you measure the health of your society at the base, not at the apex, is a reason that I decided to run as a Democrat. And so going around primary to primary or place to place now, the question that you ask is in many places the elephant in the bedroom. You know, I understand that. But the answer is the same. You know, I think we need leadership that you can trust. I think if people look at the positions that I have taken over the years, they have been consistent. There is a logic to why I believe the way that I do. And we'll just have to let the people decide. The other elephant in the bedroom is that since Citizens United, there is so much money in our political process that it threatens the well-being of how we elect people, how we approach the political process. When somebody can stand there and say, our campaign might raise $2.5 billion. I'm never going to have $2.5 billion. You'll see how I came here. I don't have a political consultant telling me what to say or how to dress or whether I ought to go to Walmart. But if people can listen and if we can get our message across, then they can make up their own minds about that. Thank you for your question.
Okay, next student question.
Senator Webb, thank you for your time. My name is Nathan, and I'm a recent graduate with my bachelor's degree from Florida Atlantic University. And my question for you today is, in this day and age, why is it so much more difficult to build consensus across party lines?
Okay, the question is, why is it so difficult now to build a consensus across party lines. And I want to make sure that was your question, right? I think part of it is what happened after the health care debate. The health care debate scared people in this country. And I went to the White House in June. Our final vote was in December of '09. I went to the White House and I tried to say, you know, the traditional relationship between the presidency and the Congress is the president proposes, the Congress disposes. And what we had with the health care reform issue was that there was no bill from the presidency. There was no bill from the administration. I'd been saying during the Bush administration, people would say, do we need health care reform? I would say, yes. They need to get the great minds and give us a bill that we can consider. But instead of having a bill, I think one of the reasons was because of what happened to the bill during the Clinton administration, where they sent an 1,100-page bill over and it got kind of torn up. The administration basically said, give us your legislation. You know, you people will over there figure out your legislation. And so health care went to 5 different congressional committees, 3 in the House and 2 in the Senate. And they came up with, as I recall, 7,000 pages. Instead of 1,100 pages, we now had 7,000 pages of contradictory information. You know, and I have to say, I have 2 sisters who are very strong Republicans, and I got a lot of emails during this period from them. And I think, you know, the country itself got worried about the nature of the leadership and then the completely partisan vote on the end of that. And people really kind of set back into their, you know, into their defensive positions. One of the best speeches that was given on the Senate floor during the whole health care reform debate was given by Orrin Hatch, my friend, a very conservative Republican from Utah, but someone willing to work across party lines. And he was saying, if you're having a bill of this magnitude, we ought to find a consensus where we get 70 people on it, not 60. You ought to be bringing some of us along with you. And by the way, when I mentioned what happened on my criminal justice reform bill, Orrin Hatch voted with me. He was one of 4 Republicans who voted with me. But the way that the bill came over and the fact that the vote was just almost completely along, in the Senate completely, and in the House almost completely along party lines, hardened both parties. You saw the Tea Party come. And then in the 2010 elections, so many people who were in the middle were gone. And when you decide what legislation is going to be voted on and what amendments are going to be allowed, in the Senate they do this in what they call the caucus lunches. Every Tuesday, the senators go to their different party caucuses. They discuss what's going to happen that week. And when you see the moderates start to leave the caucuses, it affects the positions that are taken. So that began with the health care reform debate. I voted with the Republicans 18 times on different amendments as that went forward. But in the bottom line, I have to tell you, I was thinking about my mother. Another piece of this was the Citizens United case. You know, to summarize, I've read this case. And to summarize this case, Justice Kennedy's decision basically said this. He was writing his decision based on the First Amendment. The First Amendment is sacrosanct in our country. And we had a First Amendment clash with legislation. What do I mean by that? Good legislation that we have says that if you're going to contribute to me, you can give a maximum of $2,700. But the way that this Supreme Court decision came down because of a First Amendment issue, and I'm going to explain a little more in detail in a minute, you can walk across the street and write a check for $27 million as long as it is supposedly independent of a campaign. Justice Kennedy, I think as a purist, you know, like from my time in law school, or, you know, if you're reading this as a student sitting in law school, Justice Kennedy, as a purist, was saying, No one can be denied their First Amendment right to express their opinion. That we can all agree on, as long as it's independent of a political campaign. And so we basically have, it's a fantasy. These aren't independent. I mean, people have worked together for years, and sometimes they occupy the same space, but same office space with a partition or something like that. But when you're looking at direct involvement between people who have not yet announced for their candidacy, direct involvement with these super PACs, saying you want to pull in $100 million in 3 months, you know, that affects the way people take, a lot of people take positions, and the positions become more and more extreme. So part of it was the breakup between the two parties. Part of it was the Citizens United. The answer is, I'll ask you this. How do leaders solve problems? You solve problems by sitting down with people who have the stakes and talking to them and bringing them together and getting, I don't want to use the word compromise, you're getting workable solutions that both sides can agree on. We did that on the GI Bill. We did it in many ways on criminal justice reform, and I think it can be done. That's the way that we have to turn this around. Thank you.
Thank you. Although you are still in your exploratory phase, your potential rival has been in the news a lot lately. Do you think foreign donations to her family's foundation have influenced your opponent's objectivity?
I think that's really a question for them to answer.
Okay. You opposed the invasion of the Iraq War from the beginning and predicted what would happen. How do you think we should handle the situation in Iraq now, today?
The situation we have in that part of the world, not just in Iraq, but from Iraq over to Libya, let's say, has been affected by two different administrations and two different policies that were put into effect. The first was the invasion of Iraq, which I've already gone through in detail what my concerns were. And the second was the so-called Arab Spring and how the United States implemented policies during that period. The most troublesome decision that came out of the Arab Spring was the decision of the president unilaterally to use force in Libya without coming to the Congress. I was a strong voice against this in congressional hearings and on the Armed Services Committee and on the Foreign Policy Committee, Foreign Relations Committee. And here was the circumstance, and here was the precedent that was set. Traditionally, historically, if the president is going to use military power without coming to Congress, a certain set of criteria, or one of a certain set of criteria, have to be met. Either we have a treaty obligation that compels us to do this, or we have Americans who are under attack, or there is a clear threat of an imminent attack, or there are Americans that need to be rescued. There were none of those conditions in the situation in Libya, and the president decided to use military force based on an extremely vague concept called humanitarian intervention, or in the military they call it R2P, responsibility to protect. And what that meant was, if the president in his own judgment decides that this is a place to use military force, they were looking at the example had been set in Rwanda as an area where maybe they should have, but that was saying that if the president decides for humanitarian reasons to use military force, he doesn't have to come to the Congress for permission. This is totally the flip side of what the Constitution has said about the Congress having the ability to declare war. I mean, under the standard, the president could go anywhere in the world and say, well, we have a humanitarian situation here and I'm going to use the military. That affects the whole region and other places as well. The situation right now with ISIS, first of all, I will say I think ISIS is an outgrowth of the al-Qaeda involvement in Iraq. There were no al-Qaeda in Iraq when we invaded. They later came in after the Sunni population, Sunni leadership had been totally taken out of authority after the invasion of Iraq. Al-Qaeda came in and kind of was the ugly head on a lot of the Sunni things during our years of occupation. My son was in Ramadi as a Marine infantryman during some of the worst fighting there when they call it the Sunni awakening, first with the Sunnis and then with the Sunnis deciding to take out al-Qaeda. It was a very bloody time. Very similar in tone to what you see with ISIS, although ISIS I think is much worse. But the key question for the United States in any of these situations is, does this directly affect our national security? Is it international terrorism? International terrorism does directly affect our national security. If it is, we should have a responsibility to do something, and we should be talking to the Congress about it as well. If it is not, then we don't have a responsibility to do anything. And there are other countries in the region, many of the Sunni countries in the region, who have a stake in the future of those outcomes. So I would say right now, I believe the president is within his authority and the actions that he's taken, but I think we need to be really careful in terms of how we pinpoint our use of military force there.
Japan's Prime Minister Shinzo Abe has been advocating for the expansion of their military forces. Should the U.S. support this? Actually, it's Prime
Minister Abe. I've spent a good bit of my life off and on working on this very issue. I worked as a military planner out in the Pacific. When I was in law school, I spent 2 different periods out there looking at the entire structure of our basing system in the Pacific, and as a military planner, showing how we could consolidate our military on Guam, Tinian, and the Mariana Islands with a strong sea power presence forward and still meet all of our security obligations. I think what Japan is doing right now is good. I think that the time has come. I've always supported the idea of joint operations with the Japanese military in areas that affected their security and ours. And I think with the expansion of China right now, that China's military budget is leaping in double digits every year. They are developing what we call a blue water navy, brown water navy being basically coastal operations and these sorts of things. And I think the Japanese can contribute greatly to the stability in that part of the world.
Okay, last question. If you are nominated for the president, would you consider Hillary Clinton as running mate?
I think one great lesson that many of us learned from Ronald Reagan was never answer a what-if question. Thank you all for coming today. It's been wonderful to be with you. Thank you.
There's a special gift from us. I did thank you for your time and coming to visit us, and we will hopefully see you guys in a month or so, and stay in touch. Thank you for coming. Oh, wait, book signing will be right afterwards, so if you don't come to the head table, we're going to get Jim right outside for the book signing.